The Black Death. How medieval Europe faced the collapse of civilization. The door creaks on rusted hinges. A man walks down the main street of Siena, one of the most prosperous cities in Tuscany, and the silence is absolute. There are no voices of merchants announcing Flemish fabrics, no children running between carts, no bells calling for afternoon mass. The windows are sealed with boards nailed from inside. On some doors, a red cloth hanging warns that death lives there. The man holds a cloth soaked in vinegar against his nose, as if that could filter the heavy air carrying the sweet smell of decomposition. He passes a house where 3 days ago 8 people lived. Now, through the cracks in the wood, only motionless shadows can be seen. Turning the corner toward the cathedral square, he finds a cart pulled by a thin horse. 2 men wear long waxed robes and leather masks with beaks filled with aromatic herbs. They work in silence, dragging bodies wrapped in dirty sheets to the already nearly full cart. There is no ceremony, no priest, no grieving family. Only the dull sound of bodies being stacked on top of each other. The cart departs toward the common graves dug beyond the walls, where hundreds of dead already wait, piled nameless, without cross, without record. Imagine living in a world where, in 3 years, half the people you know simply disappear. Where entire cities fall silent, cultivated fields return to wilderness, children wake up orphaned and entire families are erased in a week. Where doctors flee, priests abandon their parishes, and the basic structure of society begins to crumble. What happens when an entire civilization is forced to watch its own dissolution without understanding why, without knowing when it will stop, without having anything that works to prevent it? How do you react when you realize that nothing you've built, no wealth, no title, no prayer, offers real protection against what is killing everyone around you? This is the story of the Black Death, the pandemic that killed between 75 and 200 million people across Europe, Asia, and North Africa between 1347 and 1353. In just 5 years, this disease wiped out somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population, making it the deadliest pandemic in recorded human history. To put that in perspective, if a similar proportion died in America today, between 100 and 200 million people would be gone before the decade ended. Entire neighborhoods in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago would stand empty. Schools would close permanently. Hospitals would collapse. The economy would simply cease to function. That level of catastrophic loss is what medieval Europe experienced, and they experienced it without germ theory, without antibiotics, without any real understanding of what was killing them. Before the plague arrived, 14th century Europe was experiencing something of a golden age. Cities like Florence, Venice, Paris, and London were thriving commercial centers connected by increasingly sophisticated trade networks. The population had been growing steadily for nearly 3 centuries. Cathedral construction projects demonstrated both wealth and technical ambition. Universities in Bologna, Oxford, and Paris were expanding the frontiers of knowledge. Banking families in Italy were pioneering financial instruments that would shape modern capitalism. Merchants were getting rich importing silk and spices from the East. For the urban elite and the emerging middle class of craftsmen and traders, life was genuinely improving. Even for peasants who made up the overwhelming majority of the population, there were signs of progress. Agricultural techniques had advanced. New lands had been cleared for cultivation. Markets were accessible. Most villages had a church, a mill, a blacksmith. Social structures were stable and predictable. Everyone knew their place in the hierarchy, from the king down to the lowest serf. And while that hierarchy was brutally unfair by modern standards, it provided a framework people understood. There was a sense that the world made sense, that God had ordered things according to a divine plan, and that if you followed the rules, performed your duties, and kept the faith, you and your family would be protected. The infrastructure of the disaster was already in place decades before anyone in Europe knew what was coming. The plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, lived naturally in rodent populations across Central Asia, particularly in the vast grasslands of what is now Mongolia and Kazakhstan. Marmots and other burrowing animals carried the disease without necessarily dying from it, maintaining a natural reservoir of infection that had existed for thousands of years. Fleas fed on infected rodents, picked up the bacteria, and could transmit it to other animals, including the black rats that lived in close proximity to human settlements throughout the medieval world. What transformed a regional animal disease into a human catastrophe was trade. The Mongol Empire had created the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from Korea to Eastern Europe, and in doing so had opened up the Silk Road to unprecedented levels of commercial traffic. Merchants, soldiers, diplomats, and adventurers moved back and forth between East and West, carrying goods, ideas, and inevitably diseases. Ships sailing from Black Sea ports to Italian cities could make the journey in weeks, fast enough that sick rats and infected fleas could survive the voyage. The very networks that had brought prosperity to European cities now became highways for biological catastrophe. The disease itself was horrifyingly effective. Bubonic plague, the most common form, caused swollen lymph nodes called buboes that could grow as large as apples in the groin, armpits, and neck. Victims experienced sudden fever, chills, vomiting, and terrible pain. Many died within a week. Even more deadly was pneumonic plague, which infected the lungs and could spread directly from person to person through respiratory droplets, like tuberculosis or COVID-19. This form killed even faster, sometimes in less than 24 hours, and was nearly 100% fatal. A third form, septicemic plague, occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, causing tissue death that turned fingers, toes, and noses black, giving the disease its most famous name. Medieval medicine had no framework for understanding any of this. The dominant medical theory, inherited from ancient Greek physician Galen, held that disease was caused by imbalances in the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors believed that bad air, or miasma, corrupted these humors and caused illness. This theory made intuitive sense in a world where sewage ran through streets, where butchers dumped animal waste near residential areas, and where any outbreak of disease was accompanied by terrible smells. But it was completely wrong, and every treatment based on it was useless at best, and actively harmful at worst. The plague arrived in Europe in October 1347, when 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the port of Messina, in Sicily, after a journey from the Black Sea. Most of the sailors aboard were already dead. Those still alive were desperately ill, covered in strange black boils that oozed blood and pus. The harbor authorities ordered the ships to leave immediately, but it was already too late. Within days, people in Messina began falling sick. Within weeks, the disease had spread to the surrounding countryside. Within months, it had reached the Italian mainland and begun its inexorable march across the continent. The speed of the spread was terrifying. By early 1348, the plague had reached Pisa, Genoa, and Venice, three of Italy's most important commercial centers. From there, it moved both north into France and Germany, and south into Rome and Naples. Marseille was devastated by April, Paris by June, London by autumn. No barrier stopped it. Mountain ranges didn't slow it. Rivers didn't contain it. City walls, which had protected populations from invading armies for centuries, were completely irrelevant against an enemy that traveled inside the bodies of rats and fleas and people. The pattern in each city was grimly consistent. First came rumors from neighboring towns about a terrible sickness. Then the first local cases appeared, often in the poorest, most crowded neighborhoods near the docks or markets. Within days, the number of sick exploded. Entire households would be infected simultaneously. A man would feel fine in the morning and be dead by nightfall. A woman would develop a fever at dinner and be delirious by dawn. Children were particularly vulnerable, their smaller bodies overwhelmed quickly by the infection. The initial response was always the same: denial, then panic, then complete social breakdown. As the death toll mounted, every system that held medieval society together began to fail. In Florence, the great Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio documented the collapse in excruciating detail. He described servants abandoning their masters, children fleeing their dying parents, husbands deserting sick wives. The city government tried to organize a response, hiring men to collect and bury the dead, but there were simply too many bodies. Mass graves were dug outside the city walls, long trenches where hundreds of corpses were layered with thin coverings of dirt. When those filled up, bodies were left in the streets. Churches became morgues. Monasteries became graveyards. The Franciscan friars, who had taken vows to serve the sick and dying, were nearly wiped out because they actually honored those vows. The human response to incomprehensible catastrophe followed predictable patterns, none of them particularly noble. When traditional authority figures couldn't explain what was happening or stop it, people turned to increasingly desperate alternatives. Some interpreted the plague as divine punishment for humanity. See sins and formed movements of flagellants, wandering groups who publicly whipped themselves bloody in hopes of appeasing God's wrath. These processions moved from town to town, sometimes numbering in the thousands, their members beating their own backs with leather straps embedded with metal spikes until blood ran down their legs. Town authorities initially welcomed them, hoping their penance might save the community. It didn't. Often the flagellants simply spread the disease further. Others needed someone to blame, and in a pattern that would repeat throughout history whenever societies faced existential crisis, they turned on vulnerable minorities. Jewish communities across Europe were accused of poisoning wells and deliberately spreading the plague. The accusation was absurd on its face, since Jews were dying from the plague at the same rates as Christians, but logic had no place in the hysteria. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in February 1349. In Mainz, the entire Jewish quarter was destroyed. In Basel, Jewish residents were locked in wooden buildings that were then set on fire. Pope Clement VI issued bulls declaring that Jews were not responsible for the plague and that killing them was sinful. But his authority meant little to terrified mobs convinced they had found the source of their suffering. Medical professionals, such as they were, tried treatments based on their understanding of humoral theory. Doctors bled patients to release corrupt humors, which only weakened people already fighting a deadly infection. They prescribed compounds of crushed emeralds, which did nothing. They recommended avoiding bathing, believing that water opened pores and allowed bad air to enter the body, advice that probably increased transmission by making people dirtier. Some doctors fled entirely, recognizing that their presence near the sick seemed to correlate with their own infection. Those who stayed often wore the now iconic plague doctor costumes, long waxed coats, leather gloves, and beaked masks filled with aromatic substances like rose petals, camphor, and mint, which they believed would filter out the miasma. The costumes were frightening and probably provided minimal protection, but they became powerful symbols of the era. Religious responses were equally ineffective. Priests held special masses and processions to pray for deliverance. They rang church bells constantly, believing the sound could dispel corrupt air. They encouraged fasting and confession and penance. When these measures failed and priests themselves began dying in large numbers, faith itself became a casualty. If God wasn't protecting his faithful servants, if prayers went unanswered while good Christians died horrible deaths by the thousands, what did that say about the entire religious framework that structured medieval life? Some people became more devout, interpreting survival as evidence of divine favor. Others abandoned religion entirely, concluding that if this was God's plan, God was either absent or cruel. When the plague finally burned itself out around 1353, Europe was fundamentally transformed. The immediate demographic catastrophe was staggering. England's population dropped from nearly 6 million to perhaps 3.5 million. France lost half its people. Some regions were hit even harder. Tuscany may have lost 60% of its population. Entire villages were abandoned and never resettled. You can still find their ruins today, stone foundations slowly being reclaimed by forests, silent monuments to communities that simply ceased to exist. But the long-term consequences went far beyond raw numbers. The feudal system that had structured European society for centuries began to collapse. With so many peasants dead, labor became scarce and valuable for the first time in generations. Surviving workers could demand higher wages and better conditions. Lords who refused found their fields untilled and their crops rotting. Laws were passed trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but they were largely unenforceable. Economic power was shifting, and within a century, serfdom would be largely extinct in Western Europe. The plague had accomplished what centuries of peasant rebellions could not. It had broken the back of feudal labor relations. The cultural impact was equally profound. Art changed. Before the plague, medieval painting focused on idealized religious scenes, gold-leafed saints and Madonnas disconnected from earthly suffering. After the plague, art became darker, more realistic, more focused on death and decay. The dance of death became a common motif, showing skeletons leading people from all social classes to the grave, a reminder that death was the great equalizer. Literature changed too. Writers like Boccaccio and Chaucer produced works that were more cynical, more interested in human psychology and moral complexity, less confident in divine order. The plague had cracked the certainty of the medieval worldview. Even the Renaissance, that explosion of art, science, and humanistic thought that would define the next era of European history, owed something to the plague. The labor shortage created opportunities for social mobility. The breakdown of traditional authority created space for new ideas. The massive transfer of wealth through inheritance created newly rich families who patronized artists and scholars. The horror of watching an entire civilization nearly collapse made people ask fundamental questions about knowledge, authority, and the nature of reality. If the church couldn't save you, if doctors couldn't heal you, if kings couldn't protect you, maybe it was time to look for answers somewhere else. We live in a world shaped by that questioning. The scientific method, the emphasis on empirical observation over inherited authority, the idea that human beings can understand and control natural forces through reason and investigation, these concepts grew partly from the fertile ground of post-plague doubt. The plague didn't cause the modern world, but it cleared away some of the old certainties that had blocked new ways of thinking. It was a catastrophe that forced Europe to rebuild, and in rebuilding, to imagine different possibilities. This is the paradox of historical catastrophes. They destroy, but they also create space for transformation. They reveal the fragility of systems we thought were permanent, but they also demonstrate human resilience and adaptability. The Black Death killed tens of millions, erased communities, traumatized generations. It was one of the worst things that has ever happened to human civilization. And yet, the world that emerged from it was in many ways freer, more dynamic, more questioning than the world that went in. Not because the plague was good, not because the suffering had meaning, but because human beings, even in the darkest moments, somehow find ways to survive, adapt and build something new from the ruins. That capacity doesn't make the catastrophe worthwhile, but it does make the story worth remembering. I'm fascinated by how the same patterns of crisis and transformation keep appearing throughout history, and I hope this journey through one of humanity's darkest chapters helps us recognize those patterns when we see them in our own time.